Hello, strangers. It's Tuesday, and... What? Was this on the whole time? Also, I might just be sort of tired of the whole stock footage thing, so... As they tell me in therapy, if it no longer serves you, set it free. But that doesn't mean I could leave all of you hanging. So today, I bring you another spooky, scary story. But not too spooky. I mean, they had to live, because they told me about it. As always, these stories are true. They have had their details sanded and embroidered. As scary as these stories are, the scrutiny of an unblinking internet can be far more terrifying, she said as she showed her face. Well, as they say, Geronimo. I'm Viola, and this is Story 312, and here's what happened. When this all happened, I was working some nameless office drone kind of job. Data entry, making copies, navigating the waters of office politics. Remember, when declining a potluck, one must use 2 sorries and at least 3 sad face emojis, else face the wrath of Deborah. It was broad summer, meaning that when I drove to work and when I drove home from work, it was broad daylight. I think maybe the sun being out and it being almost high noon at all times maybe gave me a false sense of security. See, my office was in this really nice upscale high-rise, yet it bordered a really rundown area. Check-into cash places, laundromats, mattress stores that have to be a front. I mean, who needs that many mattresses? And why is there never anybody seen shopping through those giant plate glass windows? I'd been warned by several people in my office building to avoid the entire area. I was a nice girl, a good girl, from a good neighborhood, and that kind of place was too rough and tumble for me. But like I said, in the broad light of day, surely the worst of it wouldn't creep out. So when, in the elevator, I heard a couple of guys talking, saying that they'd found a gas station with the price per gallon 20 cents lower than what I was used to paying. I mean, come on. The office gig paid well, but not that well. The fact that it was dead in the heart of the forbidden territory wasn't going to dissuade me. I figured I'd just pop over there straight away after work, get my gas, and get out. No muss, no fuss. And that afternoon, that's exactly what I did. I will admit that my nerves started to nibble as I was driving through the circuitous maze-like route. Lots of rundown buildings. Buildings with tattered closing soon final sale signs, sun-bleached, holy, flapping in the breeze. The streets were pretty dead too. I mean, I saw a couple cars. It wasn't like eerie unsettling, but the occasional dust flurries and dust devils that were kicking up, it gave the impression of driving through a sort of closed environment. A biodome, or a snow globe. Instead of snow, it was dust, weeds, and old trash. Nevertheless, I soldiered on. I'd come too far. I'd made it through all of these weird little back streets. And despite the few cars that I saw on the road, as I'd stop at stop signs and stoplights, occasionally in my periphery, it was like I sensed movement behind those dark windows. But I chalked that up to just my imagination. I was giving myself the spooks, and for nothing. So it's a bad neighborhood. Again, broad daylight. And while I was dressed in my normcore office best, I was driving a beat-up Tercel. I wasn't exactly exuding the image of wealth. I made it to the gas station. It was some no-name, no-brand gas station. I was used to Come and Go, or AM/PM. But this was Tom's. Just Tom's. Not Tom's Fuel, not Tom's Cars. I have to imagine that they must have gotten their business through word of mouth, if not advertising. But from the looks of it, they weren't getting much of that either. There was only one other car at the pumps. Still, the faded sign did indeed show the promised discounted price. But as I drew closer, another suspicion that I'd had in that elevator about why it was such a discounted price, well, that proved me right. See, the discounted price was only if you provided cash. And I certainly wasn't carrying cash on me either. But, as with most places that accept cash, I knew there had to be an ATM nearby. And sure enough, as I pulled into the parking lot and parked before the ramshackle, faded paint shack of Tom's, just Tom's, taped in the window as a sign. ATM inside. I took a quick scan around the parking lot. I could see no people, only the one car that was parked at the pumps. No movement besides the occasional dust rustling the crabgrass growing out of the sidewalk. I swung my car door open and reminded myself of those tips that they always give you. That if you're ever uncertain, you want to walk with a sense of purpose. So with all the confidence that I could fake, I closed and locked my car, trying to appear casual, and then sauntered on inside. Finally, a sign of life. There was a clerk in the store. He barely glanced at me and then went back to looking at his magazine, some swap sheet or penny saver. My eyes scanned the dusty shelves. Overpriced travel-size aspirins, dusty bags of no-name jerky. The standards. And sure enough, back in the corner by the beer cooler, I saw the dim glow of green, the color of commerce, the ATM. I approached it. As with everything else in this joint, it was a brand I did not recognize. And for a moment, my nerves came back, thinking maybe this was some sort of card skimmer. Maybe I was signing up to be the victim of identity theft by using the thing. But remembering what they said to do in all those videos, I reached out and shook the little card insert thing to make sure it wasn't a plastic shell concealing an added skimmer inside. Then, as before, I said hell with it. I stuck my card in and, using my hands to cup over the keypad, in case there were any pinhole cameras, I entered my PIN and selected withdrawal. The machine began to whir. I swear I heard almost a dial-up sound coming from it. It was that old. I leaned forward a bit to confirm the suspicion, but then jolted backwards, because just as I leaned forward, from behind me, I heard the scuff of shoes on linoleum. I whirled around. Now, when I'd come into this store, I had seen the clerk, and I'd scanned around the shelves and seen no other patrons. When I'd walked in, the door had a bell on it to jangle and alert the clerk of who came and went, and I had not heard it go off, and yet, standing behind me was a man. He was dressed in a plain white shirt. Well, mostly white. It was sort of gray, like he had brake dust on it. He wore tan pants, chinos, I think, again unremarkable. And as my eyes scanned his face, there was nothing visibly weird. First glance, he would seem normal. His hair was a little shaggy, and its texture a little wavy. The kind of hair that when you get sweaty, the edges curl up. Ask me how I know. But it wasn't like wild and crazy. And he was completely clean-shaven, not so much as a speck of stubble. And his face was placid, pleasant, serene even. Aside from the fact that he'd somehow snuck up behind me in such a small store, the only issue I really had with him was how close he was standing. Because he was standing awfully close. Close enough that he wouldn't even have to extend his arm completely out from his body to touch me. When I whirled around, he met my gaze readily, and his lips quirked up in a half smile, crookedly. Now, I'm not a confrontational person, even on a good day, and all that fake confidence that I blustered out in the parking lot was depleted in an instant. I managed to glance down at the space between us, the floor tiles, the single square of floor tile between my toes and his, then looked back up at him, raising my eyebrows slightly in a surprised yet non-accusatory face, I hoped, hoping maybe he would get the hint. But his eyes just stared directly back into mine, and that smile, that half smile, didn't move at all. I turned back around. The machine was whirring now, chunking, and sure enough, it soon spat out some 20s. I ripped both it and my card from the machine and was already stuffing them into my front pocket before I could turn around. But remember, I was wearing women's office wear. And as with every other women's clothing, the pockets are usually ornamental at best. As I had feared, as I turned around, the man had finally ripped his eyes away from the back of my head, where he'd been boring holes with his gaze. Now he was looking directly at my hands, at my card, and my cash. I felt a nervous smile spread across my face. I hated myself for doing it. Even as I did it, I knew this was the wrong move. It was weak, and something about this man told me I did not need any additional help in looking weak, but it was too late. As his eyes flipped back up to mine, I realized he'd already scented me as prey. But what other option did I have? So I, just as politely as I could, said, "Oh, excuse me." I sidestepped around him and walked down a different aisle towards the door. I glanced in the plate glass as I went, confirming my suspicion. The man had not bellied up to the ATM to use it. He had turned, and his dark eyes were watching me. I walked up to the cashier and forked over the bills, and then told him what number pump I was on. I was hoping by getting his attention, maybe he'd look up, maybe he'd see the strange man that now stood stock still by the ATM, watching us. Maybe comment on it, maybe call out some greeting, recognizing the guy as a regular. But he barely looked away from his newspaper. He simply took my cash, shoved it in the drawer, as his left hand danced over some keypad, slotting in the amount of fuel at the pump I had identified. What else could I do? I turned, and I walked out the door. The jingle as the door swung open and shut behind me was tinkly, like it was giggling at me. Stupid city girl. So brave, so bold as brass in the elevator in the safety of your office building. And yet here you are, and you're running scared. Discount or not, this wasn't worth it. But what was done. I'd paid for the gas at that pump. All I needed to do was pump my gas and get the hell out of there and never, ever go back. I got back into my car and pulled alongside the pump, which happened to be behind the parked car. The windows were down, the car dust-streaked. It looked like it'd been there for a while. I could see the remnants of food wrappers scattered across the rear window, and decided I was as close to it as I was going to get. From the look of those discarded food wrappers, I could only imagine how vile the smell would be. Again, I was trying to appear casual, but I know my hands were shaking as I jammed the fuel pump into my car and pulled on the trigger to release its gas. The pump was old-fashioned, no surprise there, and the little mechanism that pumps have to hold the trigger down was gone. As I realized that to pump my gas, I would have to physically be tethered to this pump, standing outside of my car, like a dream turning into a nightmare. My mind introduced a terrible little thought. You're like a sitting duck out here. Better hope that guy stays in. And just then, the tinkling of the bell chime sounded on the wind. I didn't want to look, like a child thinking that if I didn't look, it wouldn't be true. But my eyes drifted nonetheless over to, who else? The strange man, now striding out of the gas station. And as every other time I'd looked at him, I could see his dark eyes staring right back into mine. My eyes flicked to the pump. Not only was it old-fashioned, it was also slow as hell. I barely pumped $2 at this point, and I had another 38 to go. I was stuck. I was trapped. I mean, I guess I could just abandon it, throw the pump back into the machine, drive away with my gas cap rattling against the side of my car, drive until I was someplace safe. And as the man lurched forward, that began to feel like more and more of a good idea. Some discount, I thought. But then, from the purse slung over my shoulder, I felt a buzz, and I realized my phone. My phone. I could pull it out. Introduce a different witness. Maybe somebody a little more interested than the cashier had been. With my free hand, I fumbled through my purse, my eyes never leaving the man as he trekked across the cracked parking lot towards me. Of course, towards me, making no show of looking around or even diverting to what I assumed was his car parked before me, like he knew there was no point in the game. As my hand dug in my purse for my phone, I glanced around looking for any other witness. But as before, the streets were surprisingly barren. I was alone. I was alone. Whatever happened, it was up to me. Me and whoever else I could raise on the phone. Thankfully, the man wasn't coming directly to me. He seemed to be aiming for the car before me. I felt a flash of relief. Maybe he was just going to get into his car. Hell, maybe this was just his hangout after work. The shop had been dingy, but it was air-conditioned, and it had a plentiful supply of snacks, if not overpriced. Who was I to judge what this man did? As it appeared more and more that the man was going to divert and leave me alone, my thoughts became more and more charitable towards him. But he didn't go to the car. He eventually aimed for directly between our two cars, where they had one of those trash cans with the buckets on the side with water and squeegees for motorists to wipe off their windshields. He walked straight over to the trash can, and then sort of started fiddling with the squeegees. He'd take one out, he'd sort of shake off the water, he'd glance around, and then he'd put it back. Then he'd sidestep to the other side with the other squeegee, and he repeated the process. At one point, he raised the squeegee over his head and began to shake it above himself. And then his eyes turned to me, his lips twisted into that rubbery half grin. This next part is hard to explain. If you've ever watched the old Merry Melodies cartoons, then you've seen when they have a cartoon character, Bugs Bunny or someone, having a shower. And what do they usually have? A scrub brush, right? And they'll have one arm up and they'll be scrubbing under their arm with the scrub brush. Well, that's what this man did. He did it with the squeegee. And not just miming it. I could hear it audibly squelch and squash against his skin and his shirt. I could see the white become gray, become translucent against his skin. The whole time, his eyes were staring right at me, challenging me, or expecting me to laugh? Smile? I wasn't sure. I didn't want to encourage him, but I also didn't want to enrage him, because at this point, this man was really unsettling me. His dead-eyed gaze, the way that he'd just sort of appeared, the way that he'd fixed that gaze on me, and now was seemingly performing some sort of vaudeville comedy sketch. I looked at the pump again. Only $12 in, another $28 to go. Damn this pump. No wonder they had such discounts, with all of their equipment being barely functional. I heard a sound, a step on the pavement, and my eyes swiveled back over to the man, who had, the second that my eyes went away from him, taken a step forward, and then another. He was now much closer to me. His eyes, unblinking, were still fixed on me, but his eyebrows were beginning to lower, and his lips were twisting that half smile into a sneer. He motioned at me with the squeegee. I didn't understand what it was he wanted, but then he took another step. He slammed the squeegee again into his armpit and wiped it up and down violently, to the point where it looked like it hurt. His eyebrows continued to quirk up and down, like he was seeking a response, but what response he could have wanted to that, I didn't know. I was frozen, and at that moment, my hand, which had stilled in my purse, bumped against a familiar heavy rectangle. My phone. Carefully, I pulled it out, thinking that maybe if he saw I had my phone in hand, knew that I could call 911, he might back off. He might stop this whole strange sketch and leave me alone. Probably not the response he wanted, but a response nonetheless. But oh, that was a mistake, because the second he saw that phone, the half smile dropped. First flatlining, and then lower and lower, joined by the other side of his lips into a twisted frown. His eyebrows dropped down, cupping over his eyes, and I swear, with all of the detail of watching a claymation movie, I saw his nostrils flare out, the impression being that of a bull that was getting ready to charge. He'd wanted a reaction, he'd wanted a response, but my pulling out a phone had been some sort of red flag to this man, which, looking back, was understandable. I could only imagine how many times somebody had called 911 on this guy before me. I took a stutter step back. Thankfully, when I jammed the pump into my car, I had been standing behind it, and thus, the long snaking tube between pump and car was now between us. A sad excuse for a barrier, but a barrier nonetheless. My hand was still death-gripped on the trigger of the pump. Didn't dare look at the numbers, nor did I turn the phone in my hand, bring it to my ear. I didn't dare breathe. We were locked in a terrible stalemate. All I'd wanted was gas at a reasonable price. Gas to get in my car and drive to work and be a good citizen. That was it. That was it. My nerves were shot. Not only was the lonely drive to the gas station itself unsettling, but I'd had this man pop up out of nowhere, lurk behind me, and now I had this lunatic staring at me, bearing down on me, taking Frankenstein steps towards me. The squeegee was still in his hand, a hand that, as I dared to look at it, was gripping so tight the knuckles had gone white. A hand so big, so strong, it looked like it could crush the squeegee. And with a shudder, I asked myself, what else do you think he can crush? The man took one more step forward. His lips parted, exposing yellow chiclet teeth, perfectly straight, which somehow made it worse, made it all worse. They looked like the wind-up chattery teeth toy, too perfect, too plasticine, grinning out from the twisted rubber face of a monster. But that's when another sound cracked across the parking lot. The car parked ahead of mine at the pump, the one that had seemed desolate and abandoned, from which no movement had been sensed. Suddenly, the rear left side door sprang open with a protesting, creaking groan. It shot open right as the man stepped forward into it, the heavy edge of that door catching him right, well, in the gear shaft. His lips continued to part, but they lost the tension of that sneering frown. His mouth now opened wide in a perfect O. No words came out, just a whistling, wheezing grunt as the man fell forward, his head slamming against the door, shoving it back into the car body, the squeegee dropping as both hands went to cup his affected area. He fell to his knees. The sound of his kneecaps hitting that cement was terrible. And his head tilted down, that maddening black gaze now focused on the parking lot. I looked to the car, expecting to see movement, expecting to see somebody coming out. Before I could see anything, the strange man, kneeling, squeegee at his side, began to move again. His face had gone blotchy red and purple, the effort of holding in what must certainly have been a bellow of pain. But those lowered eyebrows, those flared nostrils, those black, glittering eyes were now fixed on me in a rage. I had one perfect look, twisted, wrathful face. Before the car door swung open and smacked almost perfectly into his nose and lips, sending him tumbling backwards. He still didn't cry out. A chuffing sound came from him, like a dog sneezing. But at that point I'd had enough. When that car door swung open a second time, it had not only broken that man's nose and likely some of those terrifying chiclet teeth, it had also broken whatever freeze I had been in. I jerked the pump out of my car, not checking to see if I'd gotten my $40 or not. No discount was worth this. As long as I had enough fuel to flee this place and never, ever, ever come back, that would be good enough. I jammed the nozzle back into the holder, my hand scrambling on the side to secure the fuel cap, and then slammed the little door over the top of it. The man was still chuffing, still groaning, writhing on the ground. But I didn't know how long he'd be down. I knew I had to get out of there before I could. I raced to my driver's side door, and of course in my panic forgot that it was locked. Because of course it was locked. It was a sketchy parking lot. What moron would leave it unlocked? Probably the same moron that would have come here in the first place. The same moron that wouldn't have taken one look at that sketchy ATM and left. The same one that would have had that man in her literal back pocket and still decided to stay here and pump gas, making herself a perfect target. A sitting duck. In other words, me. As I fumbled and scrambled to open the car door, another sound joined the chuffing agony before me, and for a moment I glanced up, and that's when I saw it. In the rear windshield, where before I'd only seen discarded burger wrappers, the missing headrest, the back of the driver's side seat, I now saw a blonde head. A blonde head that continued to grow like a mushroom up above the back of the back seat. His green eyes peering at me, his chubby cheeks coming into view. For sitting in the back of that car, the person responsible for swinging that back door open not once but twice was a boy. A boy that couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, his hair a riot of gold curls, despite the rather crummy surroundings. He looked clean, rosy-cheeked, and freshly scrubbed. And as his whole face came into view, as his chubby hands gripped the back seat to raise himself up, to look at me, he was smiling, a happy, giddy, innocent smile. And as I watched, one of his chubby hands came up, and he gave me a wave. Beneath my own trembling hands, I felt the door handle finally click open. I looked down as I pulled the driver's side door open, threw myself inside, slammed it behind me, fingers already dancing over the armrest to find the lock button, hitting it way more times than was needed, all before daring to look back up through my windshield, to make eye contact with that little boy again. But he was gone. And that seemed like a sign. He was gone, and I should be getting gone too. So I did, throwing my car into reverse and peeling out of there as fast as I've ever dared to drive. I never told anybody about this story. For one, all of my coworkers would have absolutely made fun of me, if not given me a round of smug "we told you so's," because, well, they had. Nor would I tell my parents. My parents already had misgivings about me moving to the big city. If I was to feed their paranoia about big city crime, there's no telling how quickly they would come on the run, with a U-Haul ready to snatch their daughter up and bring her back home. And it's been a year or so since, and I was never dumb enough to go back to that gas station. I have avoided that entire area ever since. But even though it's been about a year since it happened, it never quite left me. Sure, occasionally when I'm having trouble sleeping, and my mind decides now's a great time to go through the catalog of terrors and traumas to entertain itself with my fear, I will see that man's face yet again. I'll swear that I can feel his hot chiclet breath on the back of my neck. I'll see the moment that his face changed from that of a man into a charging bull. His nostrils flaring out so wide, exaggerating that it's like there's 2 sets of eyes staring at me, readying to charge. But the thing I think about most is my unlikely hero. The little gold ringleted head, the kid that just happened to be in the back of that seemingly abandoned car. The kid that had the perfect timing to wait till the man was in perfect range for the door to hit him. First in the mean bean machine, and then, when one hit wasn't enough to teach him his lesson, again, right in the moneymaker. I think about how quickly he disappeared. He disappeared from view without any sense of movement, ducking back down, nor scampering away from the carnage he'd just caused. When I think about that smile, the word that comes to mind is cherubic. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't tell my coworkers because I don't want them to give me crap. I don't tell my parents because I don't want them to worry. And until this moment, I've never admitted what I think that boy really was, for fear that I'll sound crazy. But hell, people all around the world believe in guardian angels, don't they? And there's your story. I'm a big believer in balance. That's kind of why I started this whole channel, by the way. Back in 2020, I hit a really bad bout of insomnia. I do not do well in a telework environment. I need my life very properly segmented, and the blending of the two, well, it's driving me a little nutter-butters. So when it came to night, it was like everything I was anxious about would sit on my chest, stare into my eyes, daring me to close them so that it could infect me with its latest paranoia. I needed something to distract me. Algorithms must have been attenuated, for listeners at 1:13 a.m. are probably not having a good time. We should give them something to settle down. Because they did. They spat me out on, I think it was a Let's Read. I think it was him. And for the first time in months, I fell asleep. And I didn't dream. It was just one of those curtain pulls. And from there, every night I was listening to some scary story. So I took. And as I take, I must give. And well, my life's been kind of weird, so it's not like I had any shortage of material. And once I put up the call to my friends and my family, more and more came in. And here we are, nearly 2 years later. And of course, if any of you have anything you want to share, a scary story or a whodunit, socials and emails are in the description, as always, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. Always appreciate it. But fear not, I'll be back again next Tuesday, where we can do this all over again. But until next time, stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.